Wild Health is about optimizing you. We use genomics, blood work, biometrics, microbiome assessment, many other tests, and a conversation with you to come up with a full health optimization plan. What's the perfect diet, exercise, and supplement plan for you and only you? The Wild Health podcast is about optimizing all of us. Here we cover the cutting edge science that gives you the base to be able to apply the personalized plan we give you as a patient. To sign up as a patient, go to wildhealth.com. Or if you're a physician or health coach and you want to learn how to do this for your patients, we're happy to help as well. Wildhealth.com for all the information on becoming a patient or working with us.
So excited to have Dr. Erin Donaldson back on the podcast. Erin, how are you? I'm doing excellently. Nothing in the world to complain about. It's I hear there's tornadoes rolling through a whole portion of the country today, and I'm not in one of those portions, so I'm going to just be grateful for that.
Yeah, for sure. We camped out and watched some crazy weather last night and had no power for a few hours, which my husband was thriving in because he always has generators and everything ready at the drop of a hat. So we were just fine.
It's that moment for preppers to shine.
Exactly. He's the best.
Probably timely then, because I'm sure a lot of people had some significant adrenal stress over the course of losing power and being in dangerous weather. But we had a listener question that I thought of you immediately when I saw it, which was, what is adrenal fatigue? Is it real? And I thought, wow, I've asked myself that same question at different parts of my medical career. And who better to ask than the person who I think is the most familiar and skilled with managing complex autoimmune patients than Erin Donaldson. So let's just start from the start. What is adrenal fatigue?
Love that question. So is it real? I don't know. I don't, it's just one of those terms that gets thrown around. I think I prefer to use HPA axis dysfunction for the listeners. That's hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis dysfunction, like big science words, basically for saying how the brain talks to our hormones, is all out of whack. So do we see that axis have dysfunction? Every single day in our patients, I would say. So, do our adrenals actually get burned out to where they can't function? I've thought about why this happens, why those hormones lower over time after chronic periods of stress quite a bit. And I wonder if it's our body's way of trying to auto-regulate and protect ourselves, like down-regulate those hormones so they're not in a chronic state of hyperactivity, which is quite damaging to the system in numerous measurable ways. So that's my own personal kind of curiosity on it, I would say, but I don't know that we have a great scientific reason as to why, those numbers get down regulated over time and the adrenal hormones start to go down, which is, I think, what people are talking about. Symptomatically, when people say adrenal fatigue, what they're feeling when those hormones like cortisol and DHEA and aldosterone and all those other hormones that our adrenal gland spits out become lower, people start feeling kind of tired, they start feeling fatigued, their blood pressure gets a little bit lower, they're just, not feeling great. And the term fatigue fits pretty well with what we see clinically.
Okay, so safe to say that adrenal fatigue, not a traditional medical term, but probably when people are talking about it, what they mean is HPA axis dysfunction and low adrenal hormones along DHEA, cortisol, aldosterone axis.
For sure. And there's a spectrum, right? Just like everything else in healthcare for the most part, other than like acute, issues like broken bones and things like that. There's a spectrum. And there's something called Addison's disease, which is an autoimmune, severe, like shutdown suppression of the adrenals. There's Cushing's disease, which is either a tumor or steroid use or something, where your adrenals are hyperactive. And then there's a lot of things in between where there's just dysregulation. And I see that in other autoimmune. People have vague symptoms and, a spectrum of clinical symptoms and lab findings prior to a formal diagnosis. We see that in diabetes. We see insulin resistance before we see full-blown diabetes. All kinds of things show that sort of spectrum. And I just don't know that we have a great measurable way in modern healthcare to say what that spectrum is for adrenal fatigue yet.
And if somebody's coming to you, they've done the Google search or the, nowadays somebody went and asked ChatGPT, do I have adrenal fatigue? And it asked some questions back. What's your approach for evaluating this patient? I mean, number one, I'm sure history and diving into what exactly symptoms, how long they've been going on, what they're like, other known associated medical conditions, and just taking a really good medical history. But let's say at the end of that medical history, there's not a clear explanation for why this person's just low energy, brain fog, not feeling great, and you're wondering if this could be related to suppression of the HPA axis. How do you go about evaluating that?
Yeah, so we want to check their hormone values. We want to check those values I mentioned, specifically cortisol and DHEA can be very helpful. I want patients to get them early in the morning to see if the cortisol is rising appropriately. DHEA is less like temporally important as far as when they're getting that done. Those can be helpful. You can also do like stimulation tests if you're worried if those numbers are very low. You can do a stimulation test, and this is much more accepted in modern healthcare, like an ACTH stem test, or you can do like salivary tests throughout the day and something like a Dutch test, which is a little less conventional. There's lots of different ways, but I think just getting those morning numbers gives us a good kind of cheaper snapshot for them to see if there's an issue going on physiologically. Another thing I really like to look at is their heart rate variability. If they're running really, really low, that's also a sign that they're kind of chronically in that sympathetic nervous system. And whether we're seeing the changes in the hormones or not, like that's actionable in my opinion as well. And we want to work on that chronic stress before it becomes an actual hormonal issue.
Okay, so we've determined what this really is. We've taken a history. We've done some lab testing. The patient has a low cortisol in the morning, has a low DHEA that happened to be drawn in the morning, but doesn't really matter when it was drawn. Maybe we did some additional testing and it looks like they're really having suppression of the adrenal axis based on either a ACTH stem or a Dutch test. Where do you go from here?
So barring that we're not dealing with an actual Addison's disease or some sort of severe issue that could lead to an adrenal crisis. I mean, I used to do, as you did, acute care medicine, and this is always in the back of my mind. Like we want to treat this like as holistically as possible, and adrenal crises are life-threatening, right? So like we want to make sure this isn't an actual like full shebang going on, and barring that, which has not yet happened to me in the outpatient world, but I saw many, many times in the inpatient world, barring that going on, which you do want to make sure that you're ruling out, then, the most important thing I think is reducing and eliminating the stressors that are leading to this. So it's not an overnight fix for any of these patients, but we want to make sure we're eliminating the like input of stress that's causing this issue to happen. There's other supporters you can do through supplements. You want to make sure blood sugar is regulated. You want to get inflammation down, all those other things. But there's no, like, if you just think you're going to fix this with ashwagandha, I mean, it's a game of whack-a-mole, and you're going to find the next that, you're going to plug that hole and it's going to spring out somewhere else. So you need to get rid of the input of the stress as best you can. And that really depends. I think chronically typically this gets associated with emotional stress, and that is very common. And physical stress is something that can cause it just as quickly or just as effectively in my experience. We have a lot of patients that are very high achieving in our patient panel at Wild Health. And, if they're fasting 20 hours a day and running a company and eating keto and running triathlons, and doing CrossFit 7 days a week, like the body, the dose is the poison's in the dose when it comes to stress, and those physical stressors can impact the stress system in our bodies, the adrenal system, just as quickly as emotional stressors. So we want to figure out where those stressors are coming from and really target the source there.
Yeah, it's kind of remarkable how often my advice boils back down to do less and recover more,
Mm-hmm.
which is really difficult to receive as someone who is also myself, like typically piling on more than I should. So this is really the nuance of working with physicians, with health coaches, working on recalibrating expectations and achieving successful behavior change. It's remarkable how in modern society we are running on all of the cylinders, and sometimes some cylinders we don't even have. So I think that's definitely, that resonates with me for sure.
Totally. And you don't have to deep dive into like the biggest pain point right away. I don't really recommend that. It doesn't work for very many people. And it's really hard to change habits. They're usually in place for a very good reason. I mean, a lot of my autoimmune patients and a lot of patients with chronic disease in general have, as an example, a history of early trauma. And, then they form these protective patterns of being very vigilant and really good at achieving things and all these other things that they form in their habit styles, I would say, that is very protective at an early age, but you can only go at 90 miles per hour for so long before the body starts to respond. And adrenal fatigue or HPA axis dysfunction is one of the ways we start to see that kind of unfolding happen in a lot of these patients. But I think you can start smaller and really see some results. Like a lot of the same patients that are probably, with that like perfectionist mentality that might find themselves in some of these scenarios, and I say that so knowingly, is, they might also be doing a little bit too much fasting. They may have, they may need to add one more recovery day in their workout profile. They may need to not do fasted training or fasted caffeine in the morning and reduce some of these stressors on the system. So you can baby step that back. And this is why I really like heart rate variability, because people get that positive feedback as they start to see that number go up, and they think they realize they're doing good for their bodies. Then naturally, as humans, we want to keep doing those things. So, that helps that feedback cycle a lot in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, this is making me yet again realize why the answer to so many questions that we'll get sort of generally are, or why the answer is, it depends. Because, fasted training, one meal a day, prolonged fasts, just as examples, or, cold exposure, sauna use, these are, it really depends on what's going on with the whole patient, right? You may have
Mm-hmm.
somebody who's relatively low stress, obese, insulin resistant, pre-diabetic or diabetic, in which case fasted training may be an excellent thing for that patient. And, giving a 16-hour time restricted feeding window where you're only eating 8 hours a day could be a really powerful intervention. And then you take somebody who's working 60-hour weeks and going to CrossFit 5 times a week. We're not picking on CrossFit. We love CrossFit, but we just know a lot of CrossFitters who kind of go overboard. And in those cases, just introducing calories before the morning workout can be really helpful for
Yeah,
that
or
person. So
doing the coffee with breakfast after instead of, right before your workout, and really blasting that cortisol up artificially immediately when you wake up. Like small tweaks can help so much. And I love what you said. Like it really, really depends on the patient and it depends on the day. Like I have my patients think of, especially my autoimmune patients that come to me, which regularly are dealing with this issue. I have them think of each day as like a battery life on their iPhone, and your
hmm.
scores on your Whoop and your Aura can help you with this as well. If you don't have that bodily intuition, a lot of people with a history of chronic trauma or chronic stress aren't super embodied, and they have a little bit of a harder time knowing what those signals are from their body, which is probably why it got that far. So those wearables can help with that. If you're listening to this and you're like, I don't know how ready my body is for stress that day, but once you start paying attention to this and getting a handle on the numbers, you probably will become a little more aware. And think about like if you have really been taking care of yourself, you've been staying in your favorite place in the world with low stress. For me, that's a cottage on Lake Michigan, but it's different for everybody. We're when I'm up there, we're not watching TV, we're spending time with family, we're eating home cooked meals. There's not a lot of stress coming in. I can probably do HIIT training every day. I could probably do, whatever kind of stressors I want to put in my body, and I'm going to respond very resiliently. But if I'm like traveling or I just got really rough news or I slept really poorly, or I'm getting over an illness, those are going to take that battery life down. And you need to think about where you're at when you wake up in the morning. Is that really a day that you need to go hit it really, really hard at the gym? Or is that a day to have that glass of wine that night? Or is that a day to, do whatever thing might take that down a little bit more? And if not, then that's probably a day for recovery. So that tends to resonate with people, just kind of taking it day by day like that. And the
I
more
think
you
that's just
recover, the more stress you're able to put in later. So it gets people to their destination faster too.
I think that is golden advice. I mean, I'll just share, personally, I used to travel a fair amount for work. And before I tuned into this, I would routinely come back and get sick. Like I'd routinely come home and have some sort of upper respiratory infection or something going on for a few days. And at one point I realized, you know what, I'm doing a 3-hour time change. When I'm waking up for whatever's going on at 7 in the morning, it's 4 in the morning for me. I don't have to go straight to the gym at what is 4 in the morning for me to go work out. I can actually just take it easy and not be so strict with, either my fitness routine or fasting or, other things that are really in the long term good for me, but in the short term when my body's already stressed can be detrimental. So that is something I've experienced firsthand and definitely seen with a bunch of patients. I think one thing just to dive into quickly as an addendum, because I think that is a fantastic overview of adrenal fatigue and HPA axis dysfunction, is Addison's. Only because I know if I were a listener and I were a layperson, I would go, well, maybe I have Addison's disease. And, Addison's is a disease of the adrenal glands. It's primary adrenal insufficiency, and the adrenals sit on top of the kidneys. Addison's can affect people of any age, more common in women than men, mostly between 30 and 50. If I'm remembering correctly, did JFK have Addison's, or he had Cons? I can't remember. He had one of the adrenal
I think it was Addison's
disorders. And it can cause your blood pressure to drop precipitously. It can cause your blood sugar to drop really dangerously. Really unlikely to be asymptomatic.
Yeah, you're gonna know.
It's usually you're gonna know. You may have hyperpigmentation, so some darkening of the skin. It can really happen anywhere, and it doesn't happen in all cases of Addison's, but palm creases, lips and gums are common places for hyperpigmentation. And if you go and you see somebody, whether it's your primary care doctor or you're in the hospital, they'll do a bunch of testing for this. So this will be a level of aldosterone, a level of ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, your glucose levels. There are some telltale sort of sodium potassium abnormalities that happen with Addison's as well. And then ultimately you may have this ACTH stim test that Erin was mentioning already before. So I don't think there's a need to go down a deep dive of I'm fatigued and therefore I have Addison's disease. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a broader context. This is not A, very common, and B, very subtle. So this is don't get panicked about whether this is a life-threatening adrenal thing that you're having, unless you're having really serious symptoms, in which case you should seek medical care.
For sure. Mild or low blood pressure, though, I would say is pretty common with the adrenal fatigue picture. But like Mike said, in 4 years of looking at HPA axis dysfunction literally daily, I have yet to have a new diagnosis of Addison's. I've had a couple of patients that knowingly have Addison's that come to me. But I have yet to see a new diagnosis of these. Most of those people end up in the hospital, if not all, I would say. So, all is a very strong word. I'm sure it's not all, but yeah.
But it's pretty darn close.
It's pretty darn close. It's not subtle, like you said, but the low blood pressure is kind of interesting. There is some salt wasting that happens, when the adrenals are just blunted. So it brings up a good point, a little bit less of the whack-a-mole situation that we sometimes see with some of the things like, giving adaptogens can sometimes help, and some other things that can help with stress resiliency. Those might help, but it's kind of, again, that whack-a-mole path. But the salt replacement and, mineral replacement can really help, giving a good quality magnesium and electrolyte replacement or sea salt to my patients that tend to run a little bit lower on blood pressure and have lower adrenal hormones. That does tend to help pretty significantly. So that tends to be a staple as long as they don't have a hypertensive response or a high blood pressure response to it, which is pretty rare in my experience.
It's like just the longer I keep you talking, the more things I'm going to learn. But I think we're going to try and I think this is a good place for us to pause for now, and we'll come back with either another listener question that we want to get your input on, or just find some other excuse to get you on the podcast, because it's just so fun talking to you.
Good to see you as always, Mike.
All right, take care, Erin.
Thanks for listening to the Wild Health Podcast. If you found it helpful, give us a 5-star rating and write a review on iTunes. It really helps the podcast, and we greatly appreciate it. If you want to be a client or you want to work with us, go to wildhealth.com. Thanks again.